Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder. And last time, the Battle of Atlanta began as William B. Bates' division and William H. T. Walker's division attacked the Union Corps under Grenville Dodge. Now, Patrick Cleburne's division enters the fray and attempts to break Francis P. Blair's 17th Corps by hitting it directly in the flank. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Patrick Cleburne's division was aimed at the Union flank of Francis P. Blair's 17th Corps, with James A. Smith's brigade and Mark P. Lowry's brigade advancing into the open space between Blair's troops and those under Grenville Dodge. Captain Richard Beard of Canton, Mississippi, commanded Smith's skirmish line as they moved through the wide gap in the Union line. As the skirmishers moved through a wooded area and came out into the open, they saw a Union general officer, an orderly, and his staff nearby. Beard called for the mounted Federals to halt, but the general officer, in the words of Beard, raised his hat as if he were saluting a lady, wheeled his horse's head to the right, and dashed off to the rear in a full gallop. The rebel riflemen leveled their weapons and fired. Beard believed from the men who fired that it was Corporal Robert F. Coleman of Company B, 5th Confederate Regiment, that fired the deadly projectile that hit the officer. The bullet entered his back, and because he was bent over, it traveled up into the general, puncturing the lung and nearly exiting his chest. The orderly had turned his horse to ride away as well, but was knocked off his horse by a tree branch. He rushed to the general's side once he regained his composure and asked the general if he was hurt. The general groaned, "Orderly, I am." Immediately after he had spoken to me, he turned over on his face, straightened himself out, and convulsively clutched the leaves with his hands, his body in the meantime quivering and trembling like an aspen. The Confederate skirmishers grabbed the orderly by the belt and dragged him away, then asked who the general was. The orderly responded with tears streaming down his face, "Sir, it is General McPherson. You have killed the best man in our army." McPherson wasn't dead yet. He lingered unconscious as the rebel skirmishers moved past him, taking his hat and probably his belt and watch. A short time later, a Union soldier from Iowa stumbled across the body, claiming he was still alive at that point, but unconscious. He attempted to stop another soldier from absconding with McPherson's pocketbook filled with $1,000, but was unsuccessful. The thief threw the pocketbook on the ground, leaving with the cash. A short time later, some of the staff that had got away when McPherson was shot came back with an ambulance wagon to retrieve the body. They loaded it into the vehicle and sped off to get out of danger. At Sherman's headquarters, Sherman knew about the death of McPherson long before the body made it there. He took only a few moments to reflect on his subordinate, then returned to his work, stating that the army deserved his whole attention that day. He then sent an aide to inform General John A. Logan that he would take command of the Army of the Tennessee, while he saw about the protection of Decatur. Some of Dodge's troops happened to capture some rebels that belonged to Smith's rebel brigade, and were able to recover nearly all of the stolen items belonging to McPherson, including his belt and field glasses. Only his watch and hat were not recovered on the field. The famed division of Cleburne made their way through the undulating terrain, forests, and streams to engage with the Federal soldiers. The terrain split up Cleburne's men, but his brigades would do some of the most damage to the Federals that day, nonetheless. Govan's men stepped off toward William Hall's brigade, but the left side of Govan's brigade got stopped in their tracks by a heavy abattis in front of the Union position that made it difficult to attack. Despite not getting close in on the Federals, Govan's men kept up a steady musketry. An officer in the 16th Iowa recalled the scene. Officers and men worked enthusiastically. Guns became so heated that they could not be handled, the powder flashing from them as the cartridge was dropped in. The officers prepared the cartridges for the men and helped them load their guns. More splendid firing, or more effectual in its results, was never witnessed in the army. The two sides were less than 30 yards apart when through the smoke some Union soldiers saw white fabric waving. Some of the Arkansans were surrendering, and they began to take the men in and collect their weapons. About that time, the right wing of Govan's brigade wheeled to the left, catching Hall's men from the rear, capturing 6 artillery pieces in the process. Those cannons were on their way to the Union left flank to assist Grenville Dodge and his corps. The 53rd Illinois and the 3rd Iowa shifted into position to help block Govan's right wing, but it only blunted the attack. Once Govan's men found the flank of the newly arrived Federal regiments, they quickly turned it and kept driving the Federals back. The 11th Iowa evacuated their position and headed north, leaving the 16th Iowa alone. By this point, there was no hope for the 16th to get out from the Confederate pincer. In an odd moment, Lieutenant Colonel Addison Sanders, commander of the 16th, looked all around him and saw there was no hope for escape. Part of his regiment was already crossing the entrenchments and surrendering, so he agreed with his comrades that surrendering would be the best course of action. He held in his hand the sword of a Confederate officer. He returned it to the same rebel that he had captured, and then handed his own sword to the rebel. He did have one request, though. 15 citizens from Davenport, Iowa presented that sword to him, and he would like it back when the war was over. The rebel assured him that he would do his best, but after the war, Sanders never received the sword. Despite the victory, Govan's brigade was badly shot up and had around 400 prisoners to take care of, plus its 2 wings were disjointed. It would take hours to reconfigure their lines and form for another attack. Right behind Govan was Maney's division of Tennesseans. Maney had taken over the division temporarily when Benjamin Cheatham took temporary command of John Bell Hood's corps. There were 4 brigades in that division, but Hardee had sent one to the right to help William H.T. Walker and William Bate, leaving Maney with 3 brigades to follow up on Cleburne's success. The Tennesseans advanced and pushed away the weak line formed by the Iowans of Hall's brigade, then came into contact with Benjamin Pott's brigade. William McLean of the 32nd Ohio recalled his killing of a rebel officer. I drew a level bead on his belt as he waved his sword and cheered his men forward as I ever drew on a squirrel, and I know, too, that when my smoke blew away, his saddle was empty. Sometimes I wonder if it is right for a man to single out his mark that way, but I couldn't help it. That colonel was doing more against us than any man I could see, and I felt that it would help us the most to drop him. An artilleryman detailed to be on Otho Straw's staff remembered, "We were subjected to the most terrific fire I've ever seen. I never prayed on the battlefield before, but this time I prayed to the great God to spare me. I had no idea I could get out with my life and limb." To the east, Michael McGivney's brigade also stalled out in the face of the Union resistance. Out of Hardee's corps, the divisions of Bate, Mercer, who took over after Walker's death, and Maney were unsuccessful in attacking the Union line, leaving only Cleburne's division. James A. Smith's brigade was now deep into the enemy rear, and Mark P. Lowry's brigade was right behind. Smith's men were advancing to the east of Bald Hill. It appeared that Smith's brigade would crash into the backs of the Federal soldiers. However, William Harrow pulled John Oliver and Charles Walcutt's brigades out of their entrenchments and faced them to resist the approaching Confederates. Smith took some punishment from the Federal soldiers, then pulled back a short distance to see what would develop. He asked for help from Cleburne, but before reinforcements could come, Smith was wounded. Roger Mills took command of the brigade, but was soon wounded by an artillery shell. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Young of the 10th Texas took command of the brigade. The 15th Michigan and 99th Indiana attacked Young's men, capturing 17 officers and 165 men, along with some regimental flags. All but 2 men of Company A of the 18th Texas Cavalry dismounted, were killed, wounded, or captured that day. Young's brigade couldn't take the punishment from the infantry attack or the artillery bombardment peppering their ranks and fell back. They found a log cabin near where they stopped, which they tore apart to create a breastwork and settle in case of a counterattack. The brigade of Mark P. Lowry came up behind Smith's brigade, but the terrain handled the brigade roughly, with it splitting into 2, with some regiments getting lost. It also picked up some regiments from Smith's brigade and John Carter's brigade of Maney's division. The left wing smashed into Hall's line that Govan had sent to the rear earlier, with the 2 sides engaged in a bitter struggle. One Union officer described the scene. Regimental commanders with their colors, and such men as would follow them, would not infrequently occupy one side of the works and our men the other. The flags of 2 opposing regiments would meet on the opposite sides of the same works, and would be flaunted by their respective bearers in each other's faces. Men were bayoneted across the works, and officers with their swords fought hand to hand with men with bayonets. Colonel William Belknap's incident illustrates how close the 2 sides were while fighting. During the melee, Belknap grabbed the colonel of the 45th Alabama, Harris Lampley, by the coat and drug him over and behind the works. The rebel officer had been horribly wounded in the shoulder, with the bullet entering that location, then going down into his waist. He would later die at a Union hospital. Lieutenant John Safely of the 13th Iowa jumped across the works only to have a Confederate aim his musket directly at his heart. "Don't you shoot, you cuss," I yelled, "or I will order 20 bullets through your carcass in a moment." When the rebel raised up a bit to get a better shot, the lieutenant struck his gun to one side with one hand and grabbed him by the nape of the neck with the other and whirled him about 10 feet head over heels inside of our line. The right wing of Lowry's line met a larger force than the left wing. Manning Force of Leggett's division assembled his brigade when he saw the rebels coming, and as they clashed, another desperate fight occurred. During the hail of musketry, Timothy Walker, the son of Force's former law partner, was seriously wounded in the leg, just above the knee. Force went to help the captain by trying to stop the bleeding. As he was doing so, a rebel bullet entered his left cheek and exited below his right cheekbone. A nasty wound that looked worse than it turned out to be. It didn't affect his speech or eyesight, but it did leave him disfigured and in pain. The spread-out rebel brigade fell back. With no help from Maney and his own brigades being separated by the terrain, Cleburne's attack stalled out. To the north, Confederate Army Commander John Bell Hood ordered in Benjamin Cheatham's corps for the next phase of the battle. Those troops would attack near where the Union line crossed the Georgia Railroad.